Tim asked me, I don't know when, back last summer to come on up and talk to the group, and I said sure. I kind of owe a few people here in New Jersey some payback. And I would say it's a little unfortunate due to circumstances, the weather, that Kristen went on before me, because our talks actually kind of complement each other. I go back quite a while with beekeeping as to a child. My granddad was a Polish immigrant. He came over in the early 1920s, and there's my granddad, or Jadczak, standing next to one of those old Polish beehives. So I've been around them. Of course, if you want a boy not to do something, tell him, or to do something, tell him stay away from it. And as long as you keep telling him don't go near the bees, that's where he's going to go. And after my granddad died, my two uncles took over. My dad was really never into the bees, because when he got stung, he really swelled up. And then after my eldest uncle died, I started putting on the push, because Uncle Joe really wasn't much of a beekeeper. He kind of got stuck with them. And I made the case with my folks, I think I was around 14, to let me bring some of the hives to East Brunswick, which is where they lived, and also to tend the hives at my grandmother's. You know, obviously I was clueless. But I made the case, and in hindsight, I probably should have been a litigator, a lawyer. I would have did a little better. My dad did help out quite a bit, though. It was his old Ford van that we moved the hives over to East Brunswick in, and there were a couple old Polish guys in the Old Bridge area, very close to East Brunswick, who had bees. And my dad would take me there on weekends, and he would be my translator, because they would converse in Polish, and I would ask questions, and I'd usually get some kind of an answer. But one thing I remember of those early visits was I had my first glass of mead when I was about 14 years old. And the only thing I remember is it made my ears real hot. That's about it. So I guess I was about, I don't know, 15 or 16. And my mother said, you know, there's a beekeeping course at Cook College, Rutgers. It's a 3-day course. And, you know, why don't you take that? You know, maybe it'll help. So I did, and unbeknownst to me, I met a few of my mentors. That would be Rad Roberts, who's deceased, Jake Mathanius, Walt Wilson, Paul Raybould, Bob Wellemeyer, just a few. And those guys really had an influence on me at an early age. And after taking that intro course, I signed up for the advanced bee course, which was another 3-day deal. A little bit after that, speaking of Bob Wellemeyer, I got my license. And my first solo drive was to Bob Wellemeyer's, because he was in the bee business at the time, buy some foundation and bee supplies with my girlfriend. So there's romance on this Valentine's Day. I had a pretty good education, because I had a lot of different experiences with different professors. At Rutgers, some of my early work involved biting fly research with Elton Hanson's. And we worked on the salt marshes in South Jersey on deer flies and horse flies. Later on, I got to work with Don Sutherland and Bob Kent, and we were monitoring managed beehives with the Mosquito Commission because of the spray programs that were occurring at the time, to see what kind of damage was being done with the various sprays that were being used to the honeybees. And Walt was in on that stuff too. They'd actually hang helium balloons over some of the bee yards to see if it would help if the helicopters didn't spray where the bees are. But obviously the bees don't just stay in the bee yard. I also had some work after graduation. I was hired as Dr. Roberts' technician. So I managed the 5 university apiaries. They were strung out from High Point down to Chatsworth, and operated the ETO fumigation chamber with the New Jersey Department of Ag in cooperation with the New Jersey beekeepers. And that's where Walt Wilson finally showed me. He kept showing me foul. And I was like, yeah, I see it. And he's like, you don't see it. He takes me out in the loading dock, held it at the perfect angle, and those scales just lit right up. So once you know what it is, you'll know it for life. Don't fake it and say you see it when you don't, because it's very apparent if you don't know what Falbert scale is. Work was interesting and a lot of fun. So I moved up to Maine. You know, it was fun, but there was no money. In '83, figuring I'd hang out there for about 4 years and kind of whip it into shape. Maine had a reputation of having a high level of American foul brood. So I figured this is easy. Go there, search and destroy, clean it up, and then I'll move on. My purpose today, because bees have been in the news a lot, and some of you have been around a long time, some are brand new at this. And I was asked in October to speak at a pollinator safety conference. And I was thinking, you know, it was sponsored because of various agendas being put forth by various special interest groups using the plight of the honeybee to further their interests. So I was like, you know, I'm thinking, what the heck's gone on? I've been at this over 40 years, but in particular in the last 32 years, since I've been on the job in Maine. Because I take real good records, do a lot of inspections. At the end of every year, I write a report for both the department, but more so for the National Plant Board. And it's kind of just what happened this year, what are the trends, what's going on. So I'm going to share some of that with you. And what you may see, and I hope you see, is that a lot of the issues we're dealing with right now really aren't that new. And they've been going on for quite some time. So we're going to take a walk down memory lane. In 1983, and I'm speaking Maine numbers right now because we have a registration law, and therefore we have a real good idea of how many beekeepers are there, because we have pretty good compliance, how many hives are managed, and also the number of hives coming in and out of the state for pollination purposes. So back in '83, beekeeping was hot. This is pre-mites, all right? There were 728 registered beekeepers, right around 11,000 hives. There were 11,000 additional hives brought into the state to pollinate primarily the lowbush blueberries and apple, and to a lesser extent squash. There was a thriving squash industry, or pumpkins, in Maine at the time, where they would can. When I came on board, initial inspections showed that there were roughly 6% of the hives that I inspected had American foul brood, which is quite high. The national average at the time was somewhere around 1% to 2%. So again, pretty easy. Just seek it out, find them old barns full of foul, and just take care of the issues. We didn't have an ethylene oxide fumigation chamber in Maine, and this really works. And it gets rid of the resistant foul too, as far as antibiotic resistance. So the following year, we were up to around 802 beekeepers. Again, beekeeping was kind of the style at the time, and they were running over 10,000 hives. Well, things were going pretty good till '84, and that's when everything changed. The tracheal mite hit. So now we're into the mite era. So in '84, tracheal mite was found, I believe, in Texas, and subsequently found in 9 additional states. And there was a federal quarantine on. So we initiated statewide surveys. And in '84, we couldn't find them in the state of Maine. However, because of the quarantines and fear, 3 of our commercial beekeepers decided to stay north for the winter. And they did it out of fear, but it may not have been a good decision in hindsight, because they lost far more bees leaving their bees in the north in the frigid snows than taking them back down to, you know, Georgia, Virginia, or Florida. By '85, we found tracheal mite in 3 Florida migratory operations, and then by fall, 3 Maine commercial operations had contracted the disease, or parasite I should say, while they were in the same fields. The mite continued to spread, and like all the other states that required significant numbers of bees for pollination purposes, Maine deregulated along with those in the migratory circuit. We just couldn't afford to keep bees out. Bees have to keep moving. By the end of '86, our survey showed every single commercial operation except 1 had now had detectable levels of the mite. And just so you know, at that time, according to the USDA NAS survey, there were 4.2 million hives in the United States. So this is around '84. I think the '85 census showed that number. In '87, my report notes very high winter mortality, 80% in certain instances over the winter of '86-'87. Losses were primarily attributed to honeybee tracheal mite, and symptoms included acute dysentery, nosema, plenty of honey remaining, and large piles of dead bees located directly in front of the hives. Surviving hives had small clusters the size of a baseball or softball and were queen right. And surveys continued. If any of you folks, especially in a nice winter like we're having this year, see your bees behaving in such a fashion, this is not a good thing. This picture was taken, it was probably about 15, 20 degrees outside, a sunny day, and notice this hive in particular, there's a cluster of bees on the sunny side roosting outside, whereas the other, I think there's 30 hives in that yard, were nice and tight. And you can see the spotting, those of you up front anyway, acute dysentery, a lot of dead bees, but they're just hanging out there. They're not in the hive where they should be if they were healthy. If you open up the hive, and I'm sure some of you have seen this if you've been at it a while, you'll notice the cluster, again about the size of a baseball, is situated on the sunny or warm side of the hive. That whole second hive body is still plugged with honey, just as it was back in September, October, so the honey stores were still there. So, again, we went through a period of high losses, and the number of registered beekeepers in 1987 was down to 557. Right, it's gone from 802 in just a short period, from 84 to 87, down to 550. And they registered about 7,500 hives. In 87, growers used 20,000 plus hives of bees. So you can see there's kind of an inverse trend going on. Numbers of beekeepers are going down in the state, but we're bringing in now twice as many hives as we were just several years prior. Then we thought we were getting a handle on the tracheal mite, and boom, 1987 shows, and we've got this new parasite, Varroa. And again, we dropped everything. There was a federal state quarantine involved, and we started surveying migratory operations because no one could move for a period of time until they were certified and ready to go. I should say back during the tracheal wars, we originally started depopulating, meaning killing entire bee yards and operations. That only went on for a little while until we saw the futility in that. But unfortunately, the Varroa experience somewhat repeated the tracheal mite experience, but not as intense, meaning we didn't kill as many hives. I unfortunately was involved in taking out an entire operation. It was like one semi-load with calcium cyanide. It was a bad day. So, same deal. We survey, we don't see anything. In 87, the last operation I look at, which is the smallest one in the state, located way out in the mountains, southern part of the state that wintered around Orlando, of course they've got the mite. So again, kind of a repeat. In my Eastern Plant Board reports noted that we have very high winter mortality. It continues. This was in 89. 35 to 80% is typical according to the operation. I also noted that some hives are exhibiting resistance to tracheal mite, and some migratory pollinators are not removing their apistan, which is the fluvalinate. This is a problem due to the potential for mite resistance. The report also noted certain operations are now using amitraz. So you think amitraz is new, but it's been around for almost 30 years now, at least in the bee industry. By 1992, the number of registered beekeepers declined again down to 481, registering roughly 7,000 hives. The number of migratory hives increased to 33,000. Varroa is now detectable in just about all the resident sideline and hobby beehives. During the following winters, mortality continued, and we were forced to bring in thousands and thousands of packages to restock hives after winter losses. And that was kind of a different trend, because it used to be like one, maybe two beekeepers would go south, bring in packages. We probably have about 10 or more now bringing in packages to restock deadouts. This is, as of last year. In 93, the situation changed. And this is my report I wrote. Rapid increases in Varroa populations were noted during the summer and early fall. In the report, I put in quotes, colony collapse is observed during the fall with hives exhibiting PMS, the parasitic mite symptoms, and they appear to have absconded. And again, I put that in quotes. Sound familiar? It's kind of stuff they were talking about in 08, 06, 07. It's been going on. On the other hand, trichomite levels were decreasing due to genetic resistance and because the susceptible bees had died out. And on the pollination scene, I wrote, migratory hives are in excellent shape, which is kind of counterintuitive to what was going on. And I think it had to do with, again, the fact that we had fluvalinate or apistan strips, and they were taking care of the mite problem. Therefore, we weren't seeing any of this real viral issue unless the beekeepers would let the mites get ahead of them or just failed to treat, and then we had that parasitic mite syndrome brood, which kind of looks a little bit like a European, a little like SAC, a little like American, but doesn't have all the classic odor symptoms and the roping out and all that. '94, my report notes again, colony collapse due to varroa is widespread. Samples of bees and brood were sent to Dr. Shimanuki at the Beltsville lab for viral analysis. During the fall of '94, I wrote to Dr. Shim about the symptoms, and again, I described colony collapse in quotes, hives have absconded in quotes, and they did the viral analysis. I think they had to send out to England at the time. And it came back, which was published in '95, that the bees had a high titer of Kashmir bee virus and acute paralysis. What went on also that year in '94 is we had a major bee kill during crop pollination with literally thousands of hives. It was over 2,000 affected, hit real hard. And the growers were spraying for a pest called the spanworm. It's a moth, but the caterpillar does the damage. And the material was marlate, which was used quite extensively in New Jersey when I was working down here. Its technical name is methoxychlor. And the label says, as low bee toxicity. It's a group 3, don't worry about it, just kind of spray it in the evening. In our climate, that wasn't the case because what breaks down chemicals is sunlight and heat in general. We have cool, just foggy, miserable springs. I can't emphasize it enough during crop pollination. That's why we take so many bees, because they have very short windows where those bees can get out and fly and hit the flowers. For the most part, they're sitting home eating honey, and in fact, and Grant can tell you, you ship your bees to Maine, they're going to come home, if they're lucky, the same weight, but more often than not, they're going to come home with less bees and far less honey in the hives than when they were shipped. '92 was also significant in that we had our first Africanized honeybee find. And this had come in via commerce. It was a shipment from Brazil. These things were like pure African. They had varroa, but they had no tracheomite. I had to look, being as they were there. March-April inspections in that year were 16 and 55% mortality, respectively. So again, 16% of the hives I looked at in March were dead, but by April, it was over half. And again, it was varroa-related. PMS symptoms. A turning point occurred in 1996, and those of you who've been in beekeeping may remember this. The first sentence of the report I wrote to the plant board was, 1996 was a lesson in apiculture for North American beekeepers, growers dependent upon honeybees for crop pollination, and the general public. The media featured stories about the sharp decline in the numbers of bees due to winter losses, parasitic mites, and just wasn't known. Demand for bees was really high in '96. And I remember our growers were scrambling. The price of honey was very high in '96 also, very similar to what's going on now. And a number of our pollinators decided to ship their bees to the Dakotas or Minnesota for honey production rather than get the guaranteed check in blueberry pollination. And the geezers out there may remember the Save the Bees campaign by Cheerios. General Mills had the Save the Bees campaign where you cut out the little bee that's on the box of every package of Cheerios and you mail it back to General Mills, and they would give 25 cents for research purposes. Unfortunately, that program only lasted from like October of that year till the end of January, so 3 months maybe. Needless to say, they didn't generate an awful lot of money. In '97, we documented our first case of deformed wing virus. So up until then, we had Varroa, we had the parasitic mite syndrome brood, we had the paralysis virus where bees would crawl out of the hives, but I'd never seen the deformed wings. And the other interesting thing is, back when the mites first hit, you could do a sample via the ether roll or say an alcohol wash, and the number of mites per bee could approach 100%, meaning 100 bees in the jar, there could be as high as 100 mites in there, and the hives looked relatively healthy and robust. What Tristan has said earlier, but not quite in these words, the treatment threshold has gone down significantly from when the mites first hit this country to now, because the viruses are expressed at a much lower mite level. I mentioned, if you see stunted bees, that's another symptom. Even if their wings are good, if their abdomen is short and stubby, that's not good. It's an indication they've been parasitized by Varroa. The abdomen of a healthy bee should be as long or longer than her wings when they're held at rest. Some of you have seen these greasy or hairless bees. That's another viral symptom. Or bees working blueberries will go bald too from sticking their heads into the corolla of the flower. But on occasion, you'd swear it's a pesticide kill. When acute paralysis virus kicks in, the bees literally come walking out of the hives by the thousands, and they're typically the very young bees that are just hatching out. Very fuzzy. It's not old field bees with tattered wings, which are the ones that are succumbing. By 1999, I'm skipping a lot here, we brought in 60,000 hives to pollinate the blueberries. And the number of registered beekeepers continued to decline. We were down at 437 beekeepers, but they're still running about 10,000 hives. So we got a lot less beekeepers, but the ones remaining tend to run more hives thanks to the package bee industry in Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi shipping them up. During the turn of the century, there was an increase in American foul brood due to oxytetracycline or terramycin resistance. During the fall of '01, Varroa populations with were highly resistant to coumaphos. We found that. I called the manufacturer. They stood by their product. Jeff Pettis flew up. This was right after 9/11. So I was way up north on the Canadian border. An operation had treated with check mite, and the mite count was going up every day. So Jeff flew up and did a modified version of the Pettis test where you sample bees and put them in with a little piece of fluvalinate or apistan, and you can figure out mite mortality. We modified that, and definitely the mites were resistant to coumaphos or check mite. And the interesting thing I found was that individual beekeeper was pretty good and paid attention, had only used the material twice, once in '99 and then again in 99 and 2000. There's so Thailand was registered, and I was talking to Grant a little bit back about 15 minutes ago. Something you may want to pay attention to, which has been in the pipeline and is pretty soon going to become real, is called the Veterinary Feed Directive. And those of you who are into reading really boring stuff, it's called the Federal Register. All right, Volume 78, number 239. Google it. Okay, the bottom line is we're moving in a direction similar to the EU, where we're going to restrict over-the-counter antibiotics that are commonly used in animal production. So I went through the list, and the list is called the list of affected applications. And of course, terramycin's on there, lincomycin's on there, Thailand's on there. However, the powers that be, for some reason, missed fumagillin. So you'll still be able to buy fumagillin. All I can say is pay attention and stay tuned. It's supposed to go into effect in 2016. I am now in the Division of Animal Health, because bees are animals, and I've been talking with the veterinarians quite a bit about it, and they have mixed feelings. Their feeling is this is not a good thing for the hog, chicken, and cattle industry because the animals are confined so tight, pathogens move through these barns and chicken houses real quick. And their argument is the materials that are being restricted aren't being used for humans. So wait and see. The comment period is over, so it's going to be implementation of the rule that bee industry really has to pay attention to. 2002, we petitioned the EPA for registration of Apolife VAR, which is the thymol product. Maine was the guinea pig on that one. We were the first to go through the Section 18. Usually Florida does that sort of stuff. Having been through it, if you ever get into a position such as mine or Tim's, I would suggest you let another state do it first and then piggyback on, because it's why my hair went gray and it's fallen out now. We also did some work with a USDA study out of the Tucson lab with the 2 heptanone trials. And this has been floating around off and on over the years. This is a naturally occurring pheromone that the bees put out, or the queen, and we were thinking it would control varroa mite. And it didn't do much. What I found is it made the bees mean, because 2-heptanone kind of keys them up with their defensive behavior. But Lawrence Cutts, so Maine and Florida, I'm usually the cold weather person on this stuff, and the Southerners take care of the hot weather applications of the material. He affectionately called it the Preparation H experiment. On the blueberry front, 2003 was the first year hives all the way from California were shipped to Maine just to pollinate blueberries and back to California. Didn't make sense to me, if you do the arithmetic, given the price to ship, but that has been the trend. And over the years, I'm seeing hives now coming from all over the creation. California, New Mexico, Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Kansas, you name it, the Dakotas, even New Jersey on occasion. Unfortunately, in 2005, we had another pesticide incident. So this was our 3rd big incident. The first one was Dialox, then Marlate methoxychlor. Those 2 were considered safe, relatively bee-friendly. And this one was, the material is called Spintor. And the active ingredient is spinosad, which is an organic biologic insecticide. It's also a systemic, too. Once the leaves are sprayed, it gets into the plant. And again, the growers are picking these things because they're being told by the powers that be, use this stuff, it won't hurt the bees. And of course, it's typically at the end of the bloom where they've got their job done and the beekeepers are starting to round up the bees to stage them for the next crop. Huge bee kills. I'm talking thousands of hives. It affected several big operations. And if you read the label, and spinosad's sold over the counter as an organic control. In fact, I'll use it for Colorado potato beetles. It's toxic to bees for 3 hours, the label said. Well, that's okay in a warm, dry climate, but in Maine's wet, foggy, miserable, cloudy stuff, that stuff was toxic for more than a day because it never dried and stuck to the plant. So whenever you talk about pesticides or things aren't really necessarily black and white. You have to look at specific situations where you are. So brings us up to 2006. And I think I'm doing okay. The fall of 2006 was memorable due to reports from several beekeepers concerning rapid colony collapse at the apiary level. The syndrome was first called fall dwindle disease, and it was subsequently recalled colony collapse disorder. And it must be noted, for the record, in front of all of you, that in late May, that would be May 25th of 2006, I contacted one of the operations who was all over the media and on 60 Minutes. And I said to him, not in these exact words, but you better get your butt up here right now and do something about these mites, because if you don't, you're going to lose your entire operation. And at my snapshot in time, which was blueberry pollination in May, The mite surveys we were doing, I'm talking Varroa now, we were finding 70s and 90 mites on etherols and alcohol washes with 150, I take small samples, to 200 bees in the jar. There were no viral symptoms apparent at the time, no PMS brood, no deformed wings, no acute paralysis. The hives were healthy and strong. There were beards on them. I mean, they were boilers. So the bees were healthy, but so were the mites. But my experience over the years has showed, and it's in the literature too, things kind of roll along pretty good until we get some cool nights. Late August, September, and that's when the hives literally start crashing due to the expression of the viral symptoms. So nothing happened. You know, they picked up the bees, and I get a call in, I think it was October or November. I'd been doing some work in Alberta on canola with the seed companies up there. And he says to me, so how are the bees in Maine? I said, boy, they look great. You know, we had a great fall flow. He says, I've lost like 80% of mine. I said, I was wrong. I said, you lose them all. So some of them lived. But really, and I said to him, we've known each other 20-something years. Have I ever called you and said, get up here and do something? You know, I wasn't crying wolf. So kind of the rest is history. One thing that went on in '07, a lot of beekeepers were reporting really heavy chalk brood infections. And there was also an uptick in tracheal mite detections in hives. Anecdotally, the beekeepers have said when they started using Australian queens in packages, that's when they saw the problems. And as you know, the Australian border's subsequently been closed, but not because of these particular issues, tracheal and chalk, more so because of a virus that is, I think it's slow paralysis, that they say they have in Australia, but we don't have here yet. There's like 20, depends on who you read and listen to, say 25, 26, maybe 30 bee viruses. And in the past, they were latent, or they weren't here. The bees had this stuff. The only things we saw back in the day were maybe a little bit of sac brood here and there, 0.5% of the hives. Now it's quite prevalent. I see as much sac brood in hives as I do like European foul brood. So I'm trying to think when we hit rock bottom, but it was right around '04, somewhere in that area, we hit rock bottom with number of registered beekeepers. It was down to like 350, and they had registered somewhere around 6,000 hives. So that was the bottom. Since '08, I just wanted to show you some of the, I kind of glanced over Nosema, but right after '08, you know, we were trying to figure out what's eating these bees up, you know. So we started looking for Africanization and also Nosema. So I did a random survey, and we found, and again, Grant and I were talking about this earlier, the majority of commercial hives had relatively high Nosema levels, because the literature had said for Nosema apis, 1 million spores per bee is the treatment threshold. And we're finding hives running in the tens of millions of spores, some up around 50,000, or excuse me, 50 million spores per bee. And obviously, when you see a hive like that, it's usually dead within 2 weeks. But I think somewhere along the line, the treatment threshold for this new Nosema we're dealing with, Nosema ceranae, has to be defined because, again, I see a lot of healthy, strong hives with spore counts in the tens of millions. It is very variable from season to season, and it depends on the honey flow. So, '08, the trend, we have an upward trend of beekeepers. You know, this is obviously acute paralysis, or excuse me, Nosema disease. And we did some trials with fumagillin. And I did some work with my son, who's now an engineer, biomedical, and Chad Draper from upstate New York. He used to be a migratory beekeeper. And we tried delivering fumagillin in different methods. We didn't want to put it in a traditional candy board because you have to cook the candy. So we made sugar boards in cement mixers and basically put that damp sugar into a feed board or a feed rim, tamped it down. So we had 4 treatments: a control, nothing, a sugar board with no fumagillin, and then a sugar board with the proper dose of fumagillin, and then dusting with fumagillin as had been done in the prairie provinces of Canada. This work was done back in the '80s and '90s. And I guess the upshot of all of this, because I keep hearing that Nosema doesn't, or Fumagillin doesn't work anymore from the beekeepers in Maine. And my data doesn't support that. Provided the bees eat what you're feeding them, it knocks the spore load down. But there are a lot of occasions, especially when the bees really have Nosema. Think of how you feel with the flu or with, say, a stomach ache and diarrhea, right? Last thing you want to do is eat. And that's where the drench method comes in for applying the Fumagillin to get the bees to take it up. But and a take-home message from that research project, which really surprised me, because at the last minute I said, let's just throw sugar at them and see what happens. The bees that were fed sugar boards with no Fumagillin had an uptick in Nosema, statistically significant, I mean way up, over the controls, which were given no medication at all. And my kid's an engineer, so he's into numbers. He did it the biological method, which when you do biostatistics, you're allowed to throw away the outliers, right? Everything's a bell curve. But in biology, you can throw this one away and this one away. I don't know why. But I had him do it that way, and he does it like engineers do it, where they don't throw out any outliers, because as he says, we can't afford to have a jet engine have catastrophic failure because we dismissed an outlier. Okay, I'll go with that. So think about feeding sugar in the winter, especially one such as we're having now, because you actually may be doing more harm than good, unless you've knocked the Nosema down in the fall. So in 2009, I focused on surveying commercial operations for tracheal and Nosema, and only 18 out of 104 samples were positive for tracheal mite, and 165 of 217 samples were positive for Nosema. 88 of the commercial hives, 88%, had Nosema versus 48% of the hobby or stationary hives. So there's something that's going on too. And we see this over and over again. The operations that pollinate more than one crop have much higher Nosema loads in their bees than ones who, say, do like blueberries and then run on to honey production. But the ones that are really in trouble, at least that I've surveyed, to go from apple to blueberry and cranberry is like the kiss of death, and then the bees have to rebuild up from there. I will say it was 2013, I was looking at a sideline operation. He has a couple hundred hives, and he was the record. He had hives running 122.75 million spores per bee. And I was like, what? So I kept resampling, and they're all in the hundreds, 90s, and 100 million spores per bee. I didn't want to lose any sleep on it, so I called Dr. Musson out in California, because he's the Nosema guy. He did his graduate research on Nosema. And when I told him this, he goes, oh yeah, I've seen it. He just kind of dismissed it. So, okay, I thought I should worry about this. But I should say those hives were all dead within 1 week. And this was during the month of May. So they had come out of winter, and the levels just kept going up. So we did, as I said, work with different ways to deliver Nosema. I mean, our bees are usually buried. Right now, my bees, you can't even see the covers. There's just little bumps in the bee yards. But for the Nosema experiment, we had to dig them out to do the work, and those of you in front can see the mess they made when they were able to fly. I think we're going to have very high mortality again this winter. It's just been a brutal, cold winter. Our days are in the single digits. We're lucky if we hit the low teens. Nights are routinely, at my house anyway, 10, 14, 20 below. So when the media starts talking about the end of the world this spring, just remember we had a tough winter. We've had them before, and we will again. We also did some work with Hotshots, feeding a real concentrated dose of Fumagillin in a small amount of syrup to the bees. And again, if the bees drink it, it's therapeutic. Unfortunately, if you go too strong or too hot with the Fumagillin, the bees just won't eat it. It's bad medicine. So what we've done is given them 2 doses. These are sandwich baggies of an elevated dose. And some of you may notice in the fall, the books all say give them 1 or 2 gallons of medicated syrup in the fall. Well, if we have a good fall honey flow, the hives that are plugged out with honey and strong, ready to go into winter, they're not going to take down a quart of syrup. There's just no room for them to put it. So that's where the Hotshots came in. And a couple commercial operations are doing it on a routine basis in the fall. They usually cheat October into November, and then they load the bees up around Thanksgiving and ship them south. So number of beekeepers has continuously gone up since '08. And I think a lot of it has to do with the media attention to the bees and just the whole, it's kind of a cycle. The bees are dying, we've got to do something. I will say since that time, my phone's been ringing a lot more. And they concern nuisance complaints because you think of Maine as nothing but woods, but we do have some suburbs and cities. And in the suburban and urban areas, get quite a few calls. I'm sorry about this. It's just, ever since I was hired, I took a column on the left. It's the number of, it's the year, number of hives, number of registered beekeepers, and then the number of migratory hives. So basically you can see, if you could, right in the 80s, everything went to heck because the mites hit. Then as we would get a new chemical that was effective on the mite, the number of beehives would bump up again, as well as the number of beekeepers. Then as the mites got resistant to X, Y, or Z, we had high die-offs, beekeepers got discouraged, so we had dips in the hive numbers till it finally bottomed out, as I said, at 300 beekeepers back in like 2002 or thereabouts. And right now, as of 2014, we are back to pre-mite levels of beekeepers. So we have more than 800 registered beekeepers. My guess is there's probably more, about closer to 1,200 beekeepers in the state. And we have about 11,000 hives registered. Again, it's probably closer to 15,000. Depends on what day you look, because your bees are a moving target depending upon the day, the month, and the season. So as I mentioned, nuisance calls. This is an open air hive. I don't know what's going on down here, but we're seeing a lot more open air hives where bees typically will go into wall voids. I would say the last 4, maybe 5 years, I see a lot of hives that just hang in the tree and they start building their comb there. So this is one of those situations where the bees built their comb. And then people will call near blueberry fields or wherever because the bees are in the walls of their building. So it can be pretty lucrative if that's your line of work. But again, when my phone rings, people are never happy. The number of migratory beekeepers I mentioned has significantly gone up, and with that, we've had a number of bee accidents. In Maine, we've had 5 so far, 3 on tar roads or interstates. The one that got the big news occurred on Mother's Day back in '99. We had some out toward the blueberry fields on Blacktop, and then another one right in the city of Lewiston. The guy lost half a load because I don't know how, but he got his rear wheels off the road and they went down like dominoes. A lot of media attention this past spring with the load that flipped over in Delaware, and that's what this picture is. And I'd like to publicly thank the Harvey family for their efforts. Again, why am I involved? I don't know, the phone's ringing. I get a call at night, hey, you know, the bees are flipped and we're trying to get a hold of the guy in Delaware and he doesn't pick up his phone. I go, okay, well, I'm in Maine. Well, what can you do? So I called a few people, and the Harveys were one. I don't know if Dottie will ever forgive me because her net wound up on what was salvaged and wound up in Maine, and, you know, had to get the net back to her, and one of her employees really got stung up pretty bad. I don't know if he's back on the job, but if you've ever dealt with bees in a semi-rollover, they're absolutely vicious. Likewise with bear damage. They are vicious, they have a long memory, they will come after you for weeks. I will say this on semi-spills, and you may not like what I'm about to say, but at times, the best thing to do when a semi rolls over, especially on an interstate, such as what happened to us on Mother's Day, or perhaps this situation in Delaware, is to take the whole load, meaning kill it with AFFF foam. The reason being, and I talked at length with the beekeeper and said, okay, I'll talk to the people down in Jersey and Delaware, see what they can do. They thought they saved about a half of the load. And by the time those bees got to Maine, I mean, it was just a mess. Broken frames, queenless hives. The hives were put together, you know, not the right hives going together. But I have never seen hive beetles like I saw this spring, and it was as a result of that semi-flip. Those hives were just boiling with hive beetles and larvae. And I told the owner, I said, you know, by the time you catch up with these bees, because he had sent a crew up to Maine, you'll be lucky if there's 50 to 60 left alive. Because the boxes were all kind of askew, they were bent, the frames were bent, all the pallet clips were flat. We couldn't even get them on the pallets right. So the Harveys, Dottie's, she's a trooper, and they should have convinced the fire department to do it. And I know for a fact, if this guy ever loses another load of bees, he's not going down this road, let alone for insurance purposes. Because then you got to argue with insurance companies, how many are alive? Well, their definition of alive is one bee flying out the entrance, right? Our idea of what's alive is a cohesive, you know, colony with a queen and stores and brood, etc. You might have caught the news about 2 weeks ago now. The bee truck and the raw chicken truck collided in California, and they had barbecued chicken. Again, it was one of the guys who pollinates Maine. Fortunately, no one was hurt. And their bees were just kind of rattled around. They didn't lose a lot of hives. The truck didn't flip. The chicken truck took a beating. One of the problems I see frequently, you know, I'm rattling on here, so what? High mortality has been ongoing since the introduction of the parasitic mites. Prior to that, we had events, acute pesticide poisonings. In fact, some of you may even remember back in the 70s when there used to be an indemnity program by the USDA where the government would pay beekeepers for hives that were damaged by pesticides. Obviously, that money ran out real quick. And I don't think we're going to go in that direction again. But if you really look at the literature, and I got a lot of books go back into the early 1800s, 30% losses were normal. I'm not sure where this notion of 30% losses being new has come about. Personally, last winter, and it was kind of tough, I lost 12.3% of my hives. But this winter, I can guarantee you, it's going to be way more than that. And it's not going to be because of mites or CCD, it's going to be because of Mother Nature. Long periods of freezing cold, the bees' inability to take cleansing flights and to be able to break cluster a little bit and move around and bring honey stores in. The hives that are rearing brood right now, if they are probably dead, they just don't know it yet. Because those bees will not move off their brood in the coming weeks to get to the honey stores either at the periphery of the nest or above. So kind of step back and what I say to beekeepers when I'm with them, be able to see what you're looking at. Because sometimes we don't, myself included. We think we make assumptions. Since the 90s, bee viruses vectored by the mite have become a major issue. Previously, the majority of these viruses was latent, as I said before. Here's the other thing to think about with these epidemics that we have. Viruses are known to mutate. So once we go through an epidemic or a pandemic, things kind of settle down for a little while, and then usually some invasive will come in via trade. Again, I'm not saying Australia, but perhaps some stuff came in with those shipments. Because I saw very similar things while working in Prince Edward Island years before CCD was invented. That would be 1999 and 2000, where they were bringing a lot of bees from Australia and New Zealand for crop pollination in the Maritimes, and we were seeing the same thing. We'd go out there in the fall, no bees in the hives. Where are they? You know, it's as though they absconded. The bee industry is in desperate need for honeybees with resistance to both the mite and viruses. And I think really that should be a breeding effort. Subject them to viruses and see which strains can tolerate it. And I'll go back to Australia one more time. It exemplifies the mite factor in this whole bee loss CCD situation. 2 springs ago, I had the opportunity to work with a young guy, mid-20s, from Australia, 3rd generation beekeeper, big commercial outfits down there. And he was traveling with the commercials, and we were working out in the blueberry barrens, and his grandfather and father told him, we're sending you to the States to learn about Varroa because it's going to happen under your watch. Granddad doesn't have to worry anymore. Dad's handing it over to the sons. At some point, it's going to hit, and you guys better be on top of the ball so we don't follow the same path as the US. And we told this kid everything we knew and what we didn't know. But he kept talking about things such as European foul brood and chalk brood were his problems down there. One reason, because he couldn't get over-the-counter antibiotics for his European foul brood. So here's some of the other problems I routinely see. These are commercial bees. Some of you may know this outfit. But I'm seeing multiple materials in hives, registered and unregistered, with different modes of action. And the scary thing is, when I sample a hive such as this, which has checkmite, amatraz off-use label, is the cardboard there. I don't know how this thing works. Amatraz and God knows what in the Crisco, and on the bottom board, an unregistered hive beetle control, being fipronil. So at some point, the bee industry is going to have to look in the mirror at themselves and be accountable for some of the stuff that's going on. Fipronil is highly toxic to bees if they're exposed to it. And that's one of the chemicals in question with the neonics that was under scrutiny in France. The other issues I commonly see going on in crop pollination concern beekeepers picking up hives in the middle of the day that belong to them, and worse yet, other beekeepers, either during the spread, meaning prior to bloom, and I got into it with some of them this year. They're unloading semis, throwing them on trucks, straight jobs, you know, 1 tons, and hives that'll hold, or trucks that'll hold like 144 hives. 75, 80 degrees, we do have a few of them, driving 50 miles with no nets down the road. This occurred after bloom, where the beekeepers were picking them up in the middle of the day. And this is only one, it's not a swarm, it's a cluster of mean field bees. That tree and the trees, this is like 1 of 7. In some of these clusters, I think if you put them all together, they'd be the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. And I've gotten into it with some of the guys out of like in the Midwest. You know, I do not want to hear about CCD when you unload that semi out in the Midwest, because I know where the bees are. They're in the blueberry field, and they're strewn on I-95 all the way Route 80 out to North Dakota. That's where your bees are. And they say they know. But again, this isn't helping. Think about if you're the cranberry grower renting the bees after these bees are picked up from blueberries. There's no field force. And then they get into a supersedure mode, and the hive is stressed, and then they dwindle down. Another problem we see with this increased use of bees is certain growers, or companies I should say, are paying beekeepers based upon quality. So there's a base price, sake of argument, 75 bucks. Minimum standard, 6 to 7 frames of brood, a solid box of bees. If you come in lower than that minimum standard, you're docked, either $15 or $20. And if you come in with 4 framers, they won't pay you a penny. Likewise, if your hives exceed the minimum standard, they're coming in at, say, 8, 9, 10, 14 frames of brood, you get a bonus, up to 20%, or even more than that. So that $75 base can turn out to be $100 if you get all the incentives. There's a point of diminishing returns. I stress it with the growers. They just don't quite get it, or if they do, they won't admit it. The beekeepers completely understand. You bring in hives that are too strong, and again, logistically, we can't wait till there's 10% bloom to start setting bees out. This last year, we brought in 83,000 hives. So you've got to start setting them out before the flowers. So those big boilers, those hives full of bees, if the weather don't break, are going to starve to death if the beekeepers don't feed. Likewise, when the weather does break and the nectar flow hits, the bees are hanging in the trees. This one's starting to swarm. A hive that swarms on a pollination circuit is dead on arrival when the beekeeper catches up with it. The reason being, think about it. The swarm goes out, now the hive's really not doing anything for the grower paying. Right about when that queen is emerged and getting ready to take her mating flights, or maybe has taken 1 or 2 mating flights, the beekeepers are once again rounding them up, putting them in staging yards, loading semis, going to the next destination. So you want to be first in line on the pollination circuit. You don't want to be the cranberry grower or the guy renting after cranberries, because there's going to be a lot of dead outs, drone layers, queenless hives, just hive beetles and wax moths is really. So a lot of this attrition we hear about is management brought on by ourselves, so to speak. The other trend that's been going on because of this increase in bee colony use, we used to use between a half and 1 hive to the acre. And over the last 15 years, the companies have been playing around with higher hive densities. And the same is going on to a lesser extent in high bush blueberries. The average now is somewhere around 4, maybe 5 hives to the acre, but some companies are using as many as 8, 9, for experimental plots, 10 hives to the acre. So I'm talking like in this room right here, there'd be a drop in 90 hives right here, and at the back wall there'd be another drop in 90 hives. We clock them. Every 1/10 of a mile there's a drop in 90 hives. So if you're the blueberry grower, this is a good thing. Because again, you got those short windows when the weather is right, the plants are pushing nectar, and the flowers are attractive to bees, therefore the bees are hitting them. But then you might go a week with nothing. From the bees' perspective, think of too many cows in the pasture. There's just not enough stuff out there. So it's a two-way street. Yeah, we have lack, or our habitat is changing, but part of it is because of our management of the agriculture. We don't have weeds out there anymore because we're gone to mechanical harvesting. We can't afford to have weeds and rocks in the fields anymore. I got a whole another talk on the blueberry industry in Maine. When I moved up there, it was like a moonscape. There were boulders in those fields almost as tall as this ceiling. Just rocks everywhere because it was the end of a glacial till. Over the last 2 decades, the growers, they started by picking up the little rocks. Now they're dynamiting the boulders, and some of the guys who come up to Maine, they say, wow, this is like a golf course. It's just flat. These are low bush blueberries. You know, they're only about that high off the ground. Think cranberries when I'm talking about low bush blueberries. So beekeepers have gone to feeding protein. Because the other thing we see due to the lack of pollen, and this is going to kind of mirror what Tristan is saying, we've noticed the good hives will often stop raising brood. They just shut down even though there's a queen in them. And maybe it's resources, maybe it's pollen, but the trend has been to feed carbohydrates, syrup, and also protein. And only a couple operations experimented with that in the early 90s. It's pretty much the norm right now, where people have got pollen boards on, or this is a candy board with I think Bee Pro or Mega Bee in it. We had a meeting in '93, which brings us to pesticides, concerning this whole why are the bees going down. And EAS, Eastern Apiculture Society, met at Bowdoin College in 1993, and we got a group of growers, beekeepers, and researchers together. Some were like Frank Eischen out of Texas, to discuss this whole thing. And you know, we kept talking about nutrition, et cetera, and I kept saying, you know, every nice day I'm out there, the spotters are kicking me out of the fields because every day it's not cloudy or raining or foggy. They're spraying while the bees are in place. And we had our suspicions, again, we're going back to '93 now, that maybe the fungicides are part of our problem because we're always looking at insecticides because we think bees are insects. And I guess there's some work being done. I want to give you some numbers that we've seen. The most common fungicide used in Maine is a material called Bravo, chlorthalonil. And Kristen mentioned synergism. Well, we're finding levels as high as 4,900 parts per billion. Most are running in the like 1, 2, 300 parts per billion, but you see a lot in the thousands. Bravo is a synergist with fluvalinate. It makes fluvalinate, the beekeeper applied insecticide, or miticide if you will, much more toxic than it is when it's coming off the strip. Likewise, it has a similar effect to check mite. Fortunately, a lot of beekeepers no longer use apistan or check mite. Kristen mentioned detoxification. One of the reasons and beauty of amitraz is it is metabolized through a different detox pathway than a number of the materials that beekeepers are using, the growers are using, even things like thymol, which we consider benign or organic, has to go through a detox pathway. Just like when we eat stuff, it has to be detoxed. So that's why amitraz has kind of been the silver bullet globally for decades. But the day will come, because we're already starting to see it, where amitraz is not doing what it once was. When we originally had amitraz registered, I think it was back in '92 or thereabouts, it was called Mitacure. It was a 10% plastic strip. It was pulled off the market after 1 year. The new material we have, Apivar, those of you who pay attention to labels might notice that it's only 3.3% active ingredient. I think they did that on purpose. So there's a little wiggle room to up the dose as the mites gain resistance. But the problem is, as a few slides back, off-use of pesticides, which were formulated for cattle and hogs, but used on bees. Therefore, routinely, a number of operations have been using 10%, if not 12% active ingredient. If you've ever heard Medhat Nasser talk, he says it's like being a drug addict. You can never go down, you can only take more, because it doesn't do the trick anymore. So we're going to be in trouble. 20 years ago, we had a material on the market for cotton, which actually had 21% active ingredient, which was borderline killing the bees, but we can only go so high now before it has a deleterious effect on the bee, and just we'll have super mites. So it gets back to, we need genetics, we need some really safe materials. I'm talking food quality wise too, because we have to protect, honey's name. So we talked about synergism. I should mention we had one interesting situation this year. I mean, I deal with skirmishes, pre-harvest sprays. They're typically old pesticide chemistries, pyrethroids and things such as organophosphates. And they're usually light bee kills. But one that was really interesting this year concerned the DOT, roadside spraying for vegetation. Again, herbicides are considered non-toxic to bees. And in general, unless the bee is taking a direct hit, she's okay. She can go to the flower after the herbicide's been applied. It's not going to do anything. But this year they mixed in an adjuvant. And an adjuvant supposedly is non-toxic, and it enhances the qualities of the pesticide. So they went with an organic one. Methylated seed oil, made out of like sunflower seed and canola seed oil. And we had bee kill because they were going down the roads, again they violated the label if you think about it, spraying bamboo, Japanese knotweed in bloom, goldenrod and aster. So I kind of got into it with the DOT. I says, well, I know it says it doesn't kill bees, but where does common sense come into this? Maybe the guy shouldn't be pulling the trigger on blooming plants. Maybe you should have did that road or spray, say July, August before those plants come into bloom. Therefore, you still kill your vegetation and you're not having any collateral damage. So this issue is not over. So now I'm dealing with higher ups in the DOT. One of the other problems concerning the fungicides, I mentioned Bravo or chlorthalonil. Well, they have an inert in there too, and if you read the bee journals, it's getting more and more attention. It's called NMP, and it's N-methylpyrrolidine, and it's actually toxic to bee larvae. So again, decades after our meeting at Bowdoin College, which occurred in '93, some of the answers are starting to come as to why, we saw things, but we couldn't explain it. The puzzle, the pieces are fitting together little by little. Certain fungicides and neonics have been known to synergize, and this is old news. In fact, the late Dr. John Ambrose in 2001 from North Carolina State University published a paper on the synergism between neonics and certain fungicides. All are not created equal. Certain hot neonics you can mix with a fungicide, it doesn't step up the toxicity. Others that are relatively safe around bees, you give them a little bit of fungicide, it's highly toxic. I have not seen any bee kill associated with, in agriculture, use of neonics. And that includes in blueberries, orchards, which they're routinely used, nor on potato rotation. The potatoes are rotated with canola and clover, and corn is rotated with usually clover. And again, you hear studies about residues found in subsequent crops. We have not documented any of that. There have been documented situations, as Tristan had said, associated with the dust plume from planting corn in dry conditions. Those occurred primarily in the Midwest, Ontario, Quebec. That's being addressed by agricultural engineers. I will say this though, I have seen bees killed, primarily bumblebees, due to neonic exposure in nurseries. And in particular, I've seen it on potted highbush blueberry and potted lobelia baskets. They have those red flowers that hang. You see them all over in the spring. And in those situations, in fact, both of them, this was in 2011, they were treated with Safari, which is a neonic, and Banrot, which is a fungicide actually made of 2 different fungicides. This year was different, and I don't know why. I've heard from beekeepers who never complain about their bees after leaving blueberries. Some always complain, but again, for years I've been saying to them, send them in fat, because if you send them in fat, they're going to leave skinny if you're lucky, or as fat as they came in. But if you don't send them in fat, meaning heavy on honey, they're going to get back to you either dead or in a very weakened state. Almost to the clock, 3 weeks after the operations left Maine, I started getting calls from Wisconsin, North Dakota, Massachusetts, Florida. Hey Tony, what happened to the bees in Maine? What happened? Well, a lot happened. But the thing that really interested me the most was a call from a Wisconsin beekeeper, and he had set the bees out in the bogs, and again, it was 3 days after they left Maine. There were piles of dead bees in front of every hive that was shipped from Maine in the cranberry bog. So immediately I thought, well, the cranberry grower must have chemicated with something, you know, and your bees are getting poisoned. Before I could say that to him, he says, here's the weird thing. We shipped in separate loads straight out of Texas, same operation, into the same exact bogs, and there's no dead bees in front of those hives. So, is it something they picked up in blueberries, in the pollen stored in the bee bread? Or perhaps it goes back even further. Maybe it was something they picked up in the almonds, like pristine, because we do find residues of pristine in sick hives, what we call sick hives, weakened hives, which is another fungicide widely used. So I'm not going to bore you any further. You know, with PPBs and chemical names, but I do know this. Again, I have a clue, just a little bit, and the longer you do this, you're going to realize you don't know a thing. When I took that first 3-day short course at Rutgers, I had it. I mean, I'm going to teach my uncle and granddad how to keep bees, you know? But as time goes on, it's all become gray and blurry, and that's one of the reasons I went through all those annual reports. I don't want to be influenced by what I read or see on TV. I want to be influenced by what I saw and wrote in November after experiencing it. But we need more communication, obviously. We need more research, but really we need better cooperation between beekeepers and beekeepers. You can't ship your bees to Joe up the road and expect he's going to treat them well and unload them in the evening or when it's raining out or when it's freezing, because little do they know, on a bright sunny day they're unloading and putting them on trucks and driving them with no nets. Likewise, as you know, backyard beekeepers, you have to really respect each other. Think about treating. Those who don't treat, again, I got a situation that was described. Got yards marked, feed in the fall, feed in the fall. They've been treated. I know it's worked. There's no mites. I go back to feed, the hives are like lead. And I'm seeing mites on the bees after 3 weeks ago I knew there were no mites because I had treated. Where are the mites? Where did all that feed come from? Because we've had a killing frost. So it's not like they're going to flowers. They're robbing out collapsing hives. We see cycles. Pay attention to winters that are very mild. We had one in 2010-11, I believe it was, and 8-9. We had catastrophic losses in Maine those years because the bees are brooding earlier, they're coming out of winter strong and healthy, therefore the mites are brooding earlier. So watch out for them mild winters and early springs. Sure, it's great, you're going to make honey, but your hives are going to reach the tipping point about a month, if not 6 weeks earlier than normal. It used to be I could keep bees with a September treatment, 1 treatment a year. Can't do that anymore. It's typically, my strategy for the last 3 years has been, I hit them, we pull the summer honey, we hit them with Mite Away Quick Strips, formic acid. I like it because you can use it while the bees are making honey, the supers can be on. The other reason I like it is, it'll blow out old queens, and if you got a hive that you're kind of thinking, well, it'll either kill it or cure it, all right? No messing around. Then I let the bees run a little while longer. And then I do what I call a fall cleanup. So after we pull the fall honey, again, I've knocked them down, depending on the year, last of July, 1st of August. It'll vary depending upon what state you're in and your climate. I clean them up end of September into October with something such as HopGuard, or, Amatraz would work. Perhaps Apolite VAR, because that's right in the cluster. The thymol gel just doesn't do it, because it's too far away. You want these contact poisons, especially the botanicals, in their face, so they move it, throw it out the door, and get exposed to it. We're making progress, I can assure you of that, but it's at a snail's pace. And with that, I'll take questions. Or it might be time to eat, I don't know. Yes? Well, you can use, you don't want to hit them in the fall with something such as formic acid, okay? Because if you blow out your queen in the fall, they'll raise a new queen, but the drones are gone, right? So the hive is dead. So typically, the last 3 years, and I mentioned 12, again, this year I don't know, I had 12.3% losses last winter. When we pull the summer honey, which depends on the year, end of July, could be the 1st of August, right when we knock them down to 2 deeps and 1 super, we give them Mite Away Quick Strips. That's formic acid. 1 yard I treated with HopGuard this summer, the same way. Then we make our fall honey. We don't have much of a goldenrod crop. When I used to live in New Jersey, goldenrod was a crop we counted on. So after I pull the goldenrod, which in Maine is September 10th to 20th, somewhere in there, when we get them knocked down to double deeps, we'll treat them again with something like HopGuard, which is beta acids. And again, think about your climate. You don't have to keep repeating the dose because there's less brood, so you're getting the biggest bang for your buck. The mites are on the bees, there's very little patches of brood, very few mites emerging. But you could use a synthetic if you don't mind using a synthetic such as Amatraz as a fall cleanup. However, if you're going to use the synthetic, make darn sure you pull that strip out before the bees winter, because then you're going to be selecting for resistance. Likewise, if I were to use a thymol product, I would be inclined to use something such as Apolite VAR, because the wafer is broken into pieces and it's put between the hive bodies. Therefore, you don't got to worry about temperature. The bees are moving it, they're nibbling, they're throwing it out the door. I have not seen good results in my climate in the fall with the thymol gel, APGuard, because it's supposed to be situated above the 2nd deep. Now, if you put it between the 2 brood chambers, like a lot of commercials do, you may get control. But I wouldn't hit them with something hard. Apistan, I haven't seen that stuff work in years. And in fact, I kept my bees off it 10 years, or kept my mites off it, and tried to use it. It didn't work. Sure, you get some knockdown, but it's a pyrethroid. Pyrethroids are known for knocking down insects. That's why they're used in dairy barns and restaurants, but it may not kill them. That's why they add the synergist, piperonyl butoxide, right? So you got to play with it, but you want to use a material that, if you're going to use it in the summer, you can make honey. I wouldn't treat with a thymol product in August or September because my bees are making honey, right? I would have to use either one of the 2 acid products. And as was mentioned earlier, the USDA ARS has petitioned the EPA to register oxalic acid. That's been used for decades in Europe, New Zealand, Canada, and here in the States, off-label, and it works good. But you want to use that stuff when there's no brood. So that would be your ultimate cleanup. And the Canadians will do that. Because I'm on the Canadian border, I tend to watch what they're doing a lot more than what the folks in Georgia are doing. They'll knock them down in the summer with something such as formic acid, or say APA-VAR, Amatraz, and then when the bees go into these buildings, because there's no brood, they give them an oxalic acid trickle. I'm not suggesting you do that, but if it becomes legal, that's a great option. Because you could probably do it here in New Jersey Summer's around December before the weather really closes in.
Another question. Robbing. I had a significant issue with European hornets.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't have that up north. They got one, was it Vespula veltina or something in Spain and France now, and maybe Italy by now. They're just eating up the hives. The only thing I can say is keep that entrance small, and if wasps are really hitting the hive, chances are the hive is weak, but you may have to play hardball with those wasps and put out some wasp hornet baits. When you do that, obviously never use sugar syrup or honey to bait the wasps. You want to use something like cat food or tuna fish, since they're carnivores. And then you put it in a cage so squirrels, chipmunks, or whomever aren't snooping around in there. That's what I would do. We have more of a problem with wasps around honey houses in the fall of the year if they're snooping around with the bees by the doors. I can see the staff moving around. Yes, is that Walt?
Tony, who analyzes these hives for the amount of brood? Is that up to the state or
No,
the farmers do?
the farmers hire usually like sideline beekeepers. I do get involved with companies when the beekeeper and the consultant are arguing, and the company, they're all arguing, and the only way I get involved is I say, I'm the umpire, and I'm going to hear you out, and I'm going to say what I think. But I'm not, I had to do it for one company because of the bees that rolled over in Delaware this year, and that was more of a courtesy, because they really didn't want to take the bees. After they had flipped, they just said, we don't want them, and after negotiations, it was like, okay, we'll take them, but only if they're evaluated. So I did look at those 200 and whatever that did get to Maine, and a lot of them, unfortunately, weren't worth a penny. So I do it only if I'm pushed. Maybe if I retire, I'd do it. I'd give you a good score, Walt. Yes?
What do you recommend if you know or you suspect that another fellow beekeeper is not treating their backyard bees?
If they're not treating? The only regulated pests we have in Maine is American foul brood. So if it's foul, we burn them. And I should mention, we haven't had any resistant foul to terramycin in 3 years now. We did have a rash of it, and burning really gets rid of that stuff. As far as if they're not treating for mites, I would say you've got to use peer pressure and try to educate them. Because it's the reinfestation pressure. We see these cycles. After a big crash, the bees look really good for a while until they start spitting out swarms, people start repopulating their hives, and then you got a feral population set up, and a lot of untreated or poorly managed hives in the area, and then it crashes again. So it's very cyclic. If you watch these ebbs and flows of the mite crashes, they're almost every 2 years, unless we get a new virus or a highly virulent strain, such as what went on in '08, where they just literally go down like dominoes. The closest thing I've seen to CCD, the bees were robbing like crazy. Doesn't fit the definition. They were robbing the hives that were getting weak, and it just kept going through the bee yard. CCD is a syndrome. It's a nice thing. We used to call it PMS. Yes?
You were talking before about the tests you were doing regarding Nosema.
Yeah.
And you said that when later on in the winter, when they needed winter feed, ones that gave just straight sugar, wiped out more than ones.
It elevated the spore counts and actually killed some, yes. We were feeding the Nosema, essentially is what was going on.
So what would you recommend? Would you mix the Nosema in the way you're describing?
Well, the question is, we saw spikes in Nosema spore counts when fed only sugar or candy boards. And again, it's not real candy. This sugar was not boiled. It was mixed in a cement mixer. Either if you routinely use fumagillin, your fall treatment if those bees suck down the 2 gallons of medicated syrup, they should have a negligible or low count anyway, so therefore it won't be an issue. The other thing you can do is survey. Look for yourselves. I've put on a series of workshops around the state. We'll get into high school labs, and everybody in the dead of winter will collect some bees and bring them in, and it's not rocket science. I mean, I can do it. You crush some bees, you get hemocytometers, and if you don't even have hemocytometers, you can just put a droplet off of a loop, like you use for inoculating petri dishes, onto that slide. Look, if you don't see any spores, great. If they're like confetti there, you've got a problem. But the way I know the actual counts is I'm counting off of a grid, a hemocytometer. If you wanted to, again, I don't like treating for no reason, but Nosema is everywhere. And that's the other problem. At some point, fumagillin may not work. I will say this, the second best thing I've seen in a commercial situation for Nosema, again, pre-treatment, post-treatment, is thymolated syrup. Regular thymol like used in the Apivar and the Apolivar. And if you're going to play that game, it's a 1/4 gram of thymol crystals. You dissolve in a little bit of alcohol, Grey Goose. You can use cheap vodka if you want. And then mix that in with the sugar syrup. Otherwise, the thymol crystals will never dissolve in the sugar syrup. It's the second best I've seen in the real world. And this guy had 1,200 hives. A gallon, maybe 2. In the fall, they typically say 2 because bees are, again, depends on the fall. They'll suck it down. But in years where we have a good honey flow, they're not going to take a quart. At least up in my neck of the woods, because then it gets too cold. Grant.
Tony, when you started up in Maine, they were bringing in around 7,000 pounds?
11,000 in '83.
You know the acreage of blueberries compared to 83,000 bees going there now?
The acreage is very similar. There has been expansion, but likewise, land has been taken out of production to go under, conservation purposes. But it's roughly, I'm going to say 60,000 acres, but there's actually more at present. But the thing about blueberry production, or low bush blueberry production, it's a biennial crop. So you've got 1 year's a pruning year, the other year's a flowering fruiting year. So the big issue, the driving force, is the hive density.
Do you think any of that increase in bees is the quality of bees?
Certain companies are on the cutting edge, and others follow several years after they watch what the other company's doing. I would say definitely there have been quality issues. I saw them again this year. I saw absolute junk up there this year. But again, this tends to go to the smaller growers or the companies that aren't bringing in consultants to check the bees. In general, anybody who still is able to keep several thousand hives alive is a pretty good beekeeper. Or they're dumping all kinds of junk in them. But that only works for a while. There's a lot going on in the bee world right now. It's very interesting times. Yes?
Would you say mineralization aren't toxic to bees?
The question is, did I say neonics are not toxic to bees? Neonics are an insecticide. Bees are insects, all right? But compared to the examples I gave you, the massive bee kills and die-offs, these were old chemistries considered benign, bee-friendly materials. They were insecticides. I have had only one pollen sample come back from a Maine beekeeper with a neonic detection. We've never found it except till last year. And it was Helix or Cruiser, and I believe the trade name, the neonic is Actara, acetaminoprid or something. So we're not sure if they picked it up off of corn, because Helix and Cruiser are used on corn, but Actara is used on cranberries. And this guy pollinates apples, blueberries, cranberries. His bees were fine. The bee kills I have seen associated with neonics were in nursery situations, primarily bumblebees, and they were visiting potted lobelia and potted blueberry flowers, which were treated wherever they were shipped from. They weren't treated in Maine. The pots are treated for quality control, I guess, or for interstate certification. With those two, it was again the synergism of the neonic and the fungicide where I saw dead bees.
One more question. Is there a problem with the GMOs and gut form of bees
A problem with GMOs and what?
affecting the gut form of bees? Affecting the gut flora.
Depends on which study you read. The only study that I've seen that had a significant effect, again, this is peer-reviewed, not like that guy out of Harvard, okay? Concerned feeding GMO corn, and I forget, I think it was a double stacked. So it had Roundup Ready properties and a BT gene spliced in there, okay? They were feeding it at 1,000 times the field dose. And what they saw in this experiment, and they actually threw it away and redid it, was they disregarded the work because they said Nosema ruined the experiment. So there is a correlation, or there was in that particular study, with Nosema infection and that double stacked variety of corn. Don't get me wrong, bees are killed when exposed to lethal levels of neonics. But in the grand scheme of things, again, if you're a geezer like me who's been around 40 years, the stuff we're using now, we do not have the bee kills like we had even when I lived in New Jersey with gypsy moth control programs, or Japanese beetle when it was regulated, or even like Pencap M days, or what the heck, Furidan. They used to use a lot of Furidan on the alfalfa and some of the hay fields up in New Jersey. We don't see that anymore, at least in Maine we don't. I think, like I say, we're improving, but not as fast as we'd like.